So my talk today is the curious case of epistemic cognition in self-regulated learning. Now, you might think that's a bit of a curious title, but what it actually does is reflects the three areas of research that I currently pursue. I focus on epistemic cognition, epistemic emotions, and self-regulated learning. Now, I've been asked to give you an overview of the kinds of things that I'm doing currently in my research. But I thought before I did that, as Carl Sagan once said, you have to know the past to understand the present. So what I will do is I will bring you back in time, not too far back, to describe how I came to the types of research questions that I ask today. I will then present to you my current program of research, and then I will talk specifically about some future directions that I would like to pursue, and hopefully get you thinking about some things that you might want to add to your own programs of research. So I'm going to bring you back to 1992. No, this was not the year I was born, despite popular belief. Back in high school, this is the year that I graduated from high school and began my undergraduate career. Do not start doing math on my age. In high school, I was known as Math Girl. Now, why was I known as Math Girl? I was known as Math Girl because I was really good at math. I wanted to be a high school mathematics teacher. I spent very little time actually doing any kind of work in mathematics, but I still ended up doing really well in my mathematics exams and in my mathematics courses. So I wanted to pursue mathematics for my undergraduate career. So I decided to go to the University of Waterloo that has a really good mathematics program. And it has a joint program where you can become a mathematics teacher at the same time as doing an undergraduate degree in mathematics. Now, as Einstein once said, don't worry about your difficulties in mathematics, I can assure you mine are still greater. Well, why did I have such difficulty? Well, I came to the university situation with two faulty beliefs about learning. The first was that effort was a sign of inability or a sign of weakness. And the second was that learning should be quick or not at all. So why was this problematic? Well, I had gone through high school without very much effort in my mathematics courses, so I believed that I could do the sort of same thing when I got to university. I didn't have to put a whole bunch of effort into my learning when it came to doing my undergraduate degree. But that was particularly problematic, because in my first year at university, I spent more time in the quad playing euchre and going to clubs at night than I did doing my actual homework and studying for my exams. So of course, as you can imagine, when I got back my first exam in calculus and realized that I had failed, this was a serious problem. A 56% for your undergraduate first exam, never saw a failure before in my life. This was not a good sign. And so I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, if I can't pass with very little effort, then this isn't right for me. So I made the rational decision to drop out. I quit. I stopped my undergraduate career in mathematics. And then I decided, well, I need to continue on to do something, so I have to take a variety of different courses. And so I started taking psychology courses, political science courses, and the more psychology courses that I took, the more I realized psychology is actually a pretty fascinating area. In fact, as Dana Goldstein once said, psychology, unlike chemistry, unlike algebra, unlike literature, is an owner's manual for your own mind. I thought this was a really fascinating idea. We could actually understand our own behaviors. And the more psychology courses that I took, the more I realized how irrational I was, that I had simply dropped out after one failure. I had those faulty beliefs, and this was a serious problem. And as I took more psychology courses, I realized that there were a number of things that I had made poor decisions in with regard to my initial year in undergraduate university. And as I pursued higher levels of education in psychology, I really became interested in doing research. But one funny emotion that you can experience when you make these kinds of irrational decisions is guilt. So I felt really guilty about the fact that I had made that bad decision and I had dropped out of mathematics so quickly. So as I came to the end of my undergraduate career, I realized I wanted to go on and pursue a graduate level of education. But I was still kind of grieving my divorce from mathematics. So I decided that I really needed to bring mathematics back into my life, that I needed to pursue some kind of study in mathematics. And so I decided to do my master's in mathematical psychology. In mathematical psychology, we got to apply mathematical models to different types of systems. And so I had pursued this area called psychophysics. I got to mathematically model the human visual system to assess perceptual processing. I had the opportunity to take mathematics courses once again through the mathematics departments. I took statistics courses through the statistics department, and I was a happy camper. But I also had the opportunity during this time to teach and help teach as a teaching assistant for statistics courses. And one of the things that always struck me as a TA for statistics was that I heard over and over again from students, I can't do this. I hate stats. Why do I have to take this? Maybe some of you have said the same things. Stats causes me great anxiety. And this really bothered me because I love statistics. I love mathematics. And I wanted to have everyone else experience the same kind of passion and excitement for statistics as I had. So as a TA, I would ask myself, how can I create a learning environment that will increase motivation, that will decrease the negative emotional experiences that these students were having? And so I became very passionate about this question. And I decided that instead of going on in my PhD in psychophysics, I really wanted to go on and really understand how I could create, as a teacher, a learning environment that would instill passion among the students as well. And so in talking to academic advisors, they all said, you really should go into educational psychology. This is where you can pursue those kinds of questions. And so what I decided to do is, because I was taking yet another turn in my career, I had to take some educational psychology courses. I needed to catch up. And so I started taking, once I finished my master's in psychophysics, I started taking courses in educational psychology at the University of Victoria. That's where I had completed my master's. And I also started working at the Ministry of Education in British Columbia to get a sense of what it really was like to be out there as a teacher and working with teachers, to get a real sense of what it was like in the education system in Canada. And as I was taking courses in educational psychology, I was exposed to Chalmers' seminal article in 1990 called Effects of Beliefs About the Nature of Knowledge on Comprehension. And when I first read the title, I thought, well, this is really interesting. What's this all about? And as I read the abstract, I didn't even know how to say epistemological at the time. So I had no idea what epistemological beliefs entailed. And as I was reading this article, and she was describing the 5 dimensions of beliefs, 3 focusing on epistemic beliefs and 2 focusing on learning beliefs, well, it was when I started reading about the learning beliefs that I had a very big aha moment. So the 2 beliefs that Chalmers proposes are the control of knowledge acquisition, whereby an individual from a naive perspective believes in innate ability, that effort is not necessary for ability. On the other end of the continuum, which she called sophisticated, we have effort is important for ability, and effort will improve ability. The other belief was belief about quick learning. You either learn all at once or quickly or not at all, versus learning is gradual. And as I read about these 2 belief dimensions, I realized these were the 2 same beliefs that I had espoused as an undergraduate student in mathematics. It was those 2 beliefs that made me irrationally decide to drop out of mathematics. And so I thought, if I held those beliefs and made that kind of a rational decision, which changed the course of my future, I certainly was not the only one that held these kinds of beliefs. So I became very passionate about what epistemic beliefs entailed and how I could create learning environments that would ensure that students did not have the same kinds of beliefs, that we would have more constructivist beliefs, specifically about mathematics, but about knowledge in general. And so as I thought about these belief systems more and more and read more about it, I realized that there's also a link to self-regulated learning. And as I talked to researchers at the University of Victoria, they all said you have to go work with Phil. Go to Simon Fraser University and work with him. He focuses on self-regulated learning, motivation, and he'll be the person that will help you and guide you for your career. And so that's precisely what I did. So I began working with Phil in 2000, and I finished in 2004. And during my time there at Simon Fraser University, I had the opportunity to do an independent reading course. And for that reading course, that really established what I wanted to do for my career. I published in 2004 in the Review of Educational Research essentially what was my introduction to my dissertation. It really helped me to establish this is what I wanted to pursue. And I focused on epistemic beliefs, or what we call personal epistemology, in the context of mathematics. So it made me realize that I wasn't the only one that held these beliefs. And these beliefs are espoused right from the very beginning of elementary through to graduate level education. These are very prominent beliefs in the context of mathematics. I also had the opportunity to think about what the relationship was between epistemic beliefs and self-regulated learning. And that's really what I wanted to do for my doctoral work. And because that was the question that I wanted to pursue, that also happened to be the question that my committee asked me for my comprehensive exam. Now, I only had 3 days to answer this question, but luckily I've been thinking about it for some time. Well, here's my answer, and it was published in Educational Psychologist in 2007, so I figured if my answer got published, that would count as a pass, right? So very briefly, like other models of self-regulated learning, I had proposed 4 phases: the task definition phase, the planning and goal setting phase, the enactment phase, and the evaluation phase. But key to my model was the idea that epistemic beliefs are activated during the task definition phase of self-regulated learning. Now, depending on the context, different types of beliefs may be more salient than others. So it could be an instructional context, it could be the context with which the information is presented. So there are different types of contexts that we need to take into consideration. And epistemic beliefs then influence the standards that students set for completing the specific task. And then these standards then influence the kinds of strategies that individuals use to carry out the task. And then, of course, they translate into the evaluation phase, which influence metacognitive monitoring and control processes, etc., etc. So with regard to this theoretical framework, as a key question that I wanted to ask, I spent a number of years testing this particular model, as have others. So here's a list of some of the articles that we had tested and published in testing this particular model. But very briefly, researchers have demonstrated typically that more constructivist epistemic beliefs, such as that knowledge is complex, it's tentative, personally constructed, and critically evaluated, typically result in deeper processing strategies such as critical thinking, elaboration, or metacognitive monitoring, and this has implications for learning outcomes. Typically, we see higher levels of achievement, but it's not always the case. Okay? So there are caveats to this. In contrast, individuals who espouse less constructivist epistemic beliefs, that knowledge is simple, that it's certain, that it's handed down by authority, and blindly accepted, typically believe that critical thinking isn't really necessary. If the experts know what they know and tell us what we need to know, then we don't really need to think critically about anything. Okay? That, of course, has implications for learning outcomes. Typically, we see lower levels of achievement. But again, there's caveats to that. Take, for example, a situation in which an instructor gives students a multiple choice exam or a short answer exam and expects that students regurgitate the information or just have to recognize the answer. Well, if you engage in shallow processing strategies, you're going to do well. So it really does depend on the assessment context. So again, context matters. And as I began testing the theoretical framework, there was still a question that was bothering me that I had identified in the review that I had conducted as a graduate student. And that was the issue of domain specificity. Now, as I had finished my degree and went on to UNLV to pursue my academic career, I met up with Lisa Dixon and Florian Harley, and they had some similar issues as well with regard to whether the beliefs were domain general or domain specific. And so we weren't really finished assessing whether beliefs were domain general or domain specific. Typically, multidimensional models had assumed that they were domain general, as had the developmental models, but there still was this question of whether they were more domain specific. If you look at the expertise literature, they are very specific. Motivation is domain specific. And so I was kind of concerned about the methodological approaches that individuals had used to assess this question. Looking at filling out a self-report, state your beliefs about mathematics and history, and let's correlate the two. Oh look, they're correlated, so they're domain general. Well, that's not really the way we should be doing it. And so what we did is we conducted a thorough review of the issue of domain specificity versus generality. But we wanted to move beyond just educational psychology. We decided to dip into philosophy, which was a very interesting adventure to say the least. But it was an important one because we wanted to be informed by other fields other than educational psychology. And we identified that beliefs are actually, in fact, both domain general and domain specific. If you look at the philosophical literature, there's a lot of similarities with regard to underlying epistemologies across different domains, but there are also some key differences as well. So we proposed the TIDE framework, the Theory of Integrated Domains and Epistemology framework. And Barbara Hofer and Pat Alexander were kind enough to provide responses to our theoretical framework. In essence, we identify that there are general beliefs. So you begin to develop beliefs about general knowledge, so knowledge outside of the school context. Then as you walk into or start your academic career in elementary school, you begin to develop beliefs specific to the school context or school knowledge. And in interviews with students can actually identify, well, this is what we believe in the school context or school knowledge, excuse me, but we can differentiate with what we learn outside the real world, so in the real world context. And so we have these two different belief systems. And as we progress through higher levels of education, we develop more domain-specific beliefs. And we had hypothesized that these beliefs develop within an instructional context, so what happens in the classroom has a big part of what kinds of beliefs you espouse or develop over time. And as you progress through higher levels of education, these become more prominent. And they're all reciprocally influential. And we've conducted a number of studies to assess these kinds of relationships. And what we've discovered is that it's extraordinarily difficult to measure beliefs in general, let alone trying to map them across different levels of specificity. So then it became interesting to me, well, if we know or believe that the instructional context is an important context whereby students' beliefs develop, we should be able to create an instructional context that will foster more constructivist epistemic beliefs. And so for me, it became important to look at the epistemic climate, and specifically developing an epistemic climate for epistemic change, so that students would not espouse the kinds of naive beliefs, as Sharma called them, with regard to knowledge and knowing, but really developing constructivist beliefs where students believe that critical thinking is an important part of learning. And so as Daniel Dennett once said, people like to believe in belief. And this certainly is the case, especially in mathematics context. If you think about the 20, 30 years of mathematics education that you received, typically we see more traditional approaches to teaching mathematics. And so students have this belief that the teacher is the source of knowledge when it comes to math, and only experts can create mathematics knowledge. And those are really difficult beliefs to change. But we thought we'd give it a try anyway. So in one study that was published in Journal of Educational Psychology, I had the opportunity to teach a statistics course at the graduate level. I had taught it many times, but I had an opportunity to have someone else take and use the exact same materials that I had used, exact same tests, same labs. The difference was I let him go on and do the traditional approach to teaching, and for my own course, I had relied on the conceptual change literature to really assess how I could change individuals' beliefs. And so what I did is I created a number of discrepant events for students. I had them take a data set, and they had to apply a Bayesian approach versus a more traditional approach. And what ended up happening was one decision was reject, the other was fail to reject them all. And so students had a discrepant event. They took different methods to come up with a particular answer, but the answers were completely contradictory. So how do you grapple with that? And then linking statistics knowledge to the real world context and having students identify ways in which they could solve different statistics problems and demonstrate to them that knowledge in statistics is tentative, that we come up with better methodologies. Maybe it takes a little longer than the social sciences, but this was really important for students to see. And so what we did is we measured their beliefs right from the beginning of the course, and every few weeks we had them self-report their beliefs. But I also believe that if you're going to change epistemic beliefs, you also need to change the processes that students use. So self-regulated learning was an important consideration. What do they need to know? They need to know how to think critically. They need to know how to elaborate the information that they're learning so that they can apply what they're learning to a real-world context. And so I modeled for them critical thinking and elaboration skills, and that was slowly scaffolded. The scaffold was slowly removed over the course of the semester. So what did we see? So when it comes to the self-reports, lower scores reflect more constructivist epistemic beliefs. The intervention group is this group here, and the control group is here. As you can see, so we've got weeks 2 to week 15. Week 13 was how long the course was, but we measured them 2 weeks after the course to see if there was lasting change. Beliefs didn't really start to shift until week 8. That was similar for the attainability of truth. Is truth attainable in statistics? We really didn't see a shift until about week 8. So midway through the semester, they started shifting their beliefs. Same with the source of knowledge. Actually, this one was even more challenging to change. Okay, so typically students say, well, you're the expert, you tell me what I need to know. Okay? okay? I'm not going to be able to construct knowledge and statistics. Are you crazy? I'm not brilliant enough to do that. Well, that belief was extraordinarily difficult to change, and it did change, but not until like the end of the semester, so we're looking at week 12. And similarly for the certainty and simplicity of knowledge, beliefs began to shift around week 8. Okay, and those were lasting changes. With regard to learning strategies, critical thinking, they started to again shift around week 8, so they self-reported more use of critical thinking strategies over the course of the semester for the intervention group, so this time we want to see the scores go up. Okay, and similarly for elaboration strategies as well. That was something that was a little bit easier for students to do. We started to see a shift at around week 4. Now, one thing that really struck me as I engaged in this course, it was a pretty risky thing to do, to actually demand students to actually think critically, think on their own, and be presented with all of these discrepant events. So the reactions to the demands of the course were pretty negative at the very beginning. Students were really frustrated with me, they were angry, they were anxious, among other things. And so it became clear to me that despite the fact that I had tried to ignore emotions for a really long time, I could no longer ignore emotions, especially when we were focusing on epistemic change. Emotions were something that I needed to take into consideration in my own research. And luckily enough, I had been able to see Pekrin's keynote talk in Amsterdam in 2009, and I realized that this is something that I needed to bring into my own theoretical framework. And so I did, and I began working with Reinhardt over the last few years, looking at the role of emotions in mediating relations between epistemic beliefs and self-regulated learning, especially in the context of epistemic change. So very briefly, Pekrin's theoretical framework focuses on control and value as antecedents to the kinds of emotions that students experience when they engage in a particular task. Now, like my own theoretical model, Pekrin proposes that there are environmental factors that we need to take into consideration. These include the task demands, the quality of instruction, the classroom goal structures that give rise to these perceptions of control and value. Now, control focuses on expectancies and attributions, so from Weiner's work, and then values focus on both intrinsic and extrinsic value. So as students develop these perceptions of control and value, these interact to predict the kinds of emotional experiences they will have during engagement in a task. So an interaction between, let's say, a low level of control and a high sense of value, what emotion do you think that they'll experience? Low control, high value? Anxiety. Okay. Especially if you really value something, really value mathematics, but you feel like you have no control, well, that's going to cause a lot of anxiety. Okay? So the emotions that students experience during an achievement situation, there's a variety of different kinds. There's activity emotions, so the emotions that you experience as you engage in an activity. And there's also outcome emotions, like prospective anxiety about an upcoming test, or retrospective emotions such as relief when you've completed that task. The kinds of emotional experiences you have during task engagement will actually predict the kinds of learning strategies that you use. And they can be delineated by positive or negative and activating versus deactivating. So let's say you have a positive activating emotion such as enjoyment, you're more likely to engage in a flexible processing strategy or deprocessing strategy like elaboration, critical thinking, whereas a negative activating emotion such as anxiety, frustration, because it consumes so many cognitive resources, you're more likely to engage in more rigid processing strategies such as maintenance rehearsal. So that's a shallow processing strategy. And this has implications for learning outcomes. Okay? So higher levels of enjoyment, typically with better learning strategies, higher levels of achievement outcomes, and conversely for more negative activating emotions. And then of course there's that bad emotion, boredom, which is completely deactivating and people typically disengage during boredom. When we look at the different kinds of emotions, recently Pekrin proposed a new type of emotion. It's new to educational psychology, and it's called an epistemic emotion. Epistemic emotions focus on knowledge-generating processes or on contexts of knowledge and knowing. So when we think about epistemic emotions, it only makes sense to think that perhaps epistemic beliefs might be an important antecedent to the kinds of epistemic emotions that students experience. We're focusing on epistemic beliefs as beliefs about knowledge and knowing, and epistemic emotions focus on knowledge generation, then the antecedent of epistemic beliefs to epistemic emotions seems to make sense. And when we look at the parallels between my theoretical framework and Peckard's theoretical framework, it only made sense to put our frameworks together, and so we did so. So what we did is we proposed what's called the cognitive incongruity model. This is recently published in Learning and Instruction. And what we hypothesize is that, let's say an individual espouses the belief in the context of climate change that experts have all of the answers, that there is no disagreement between experts with regard to the causes and consequences of climate change. Now, when presented with contradictory and conflicting information on the causes and consequences of climate change, this is counter to an individual's beliefs. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be cognitive incongruity. That's going to trigger negative emotions, such as surprise, which is a neutral emotion, confusion, possibly anxiety and frustration if that confusion cannot be resolved. This, of course, has implications for the kinds of learning strategies an individual will use in learning in that particular context. And that, of course, will have learning outcome implications. In contrast, if an individual believes that knowledge about climate change is constantly changing, it's shifting, it's tentative, experts don't necessarily agree. They realize that some experts say, well, the causes of climate change are man-made, whereas others might say, well, it's naturally occurring. If they know those differences exist and are presented with contradictory information about the causes and consequences of climate change, they're not going to be surprised. This is what they expect. In fact, they might actually enjoy this conflict because it's consistent with their own epistemic beliefs. And in that case, we'd expect to see higher levels of enjoyment and curiosity and lower levels of confusion, frustration, anxiety, and boredom. And so we went about testing this model. And it was done in Canada, the United States, and in Germany. We sampled 439 participants, and we presented to them 4 conflicting texts by experts about the causes and consequences of climate change to assess the kinds of emotional experiences that they would have in the context of reading this contradictory information. We measured their epistemic emotions as they occurred after reading each of the texts. Okay, this is about to be a little bit of an LA freeway here. What we found was that epistemic beliefs did, in fact, predict the kinds of emotions that students experience during reading of these 4 contradictory texts. Okay, this, of course, is controlled for by prior knowledge, etc. So I'll highlight a few here. Justification for inquiry, so a belief that you really do need to think critically and that you need to compare experts' positions on the causes and consequences of climate change, resulted in higher levels of curiosity and enjoyment and lower levels of boredom. Okay? Similarly, with complexity, if you believe that knowledge in climate change is complex, you have lower levels of confusion, anxiety, and boredom. With regard to learning strategies, oh, and of course, the emotions-mediated relations between epistemic beliefs and self-regulated learning, as we had predicted. Okay, well, strategies at least. I'll highlight a few here. Curiosity was a positive predictor of metacognitive self-regulation, critical thinking, and elaboration. And confusion was an interesting one. The more that students were confused, the more they metacognitively monitored, which makes sense. When you're confused, you're going back and you're going, why am I confused? What's wrong with this information here? Why is it contradictory? And what we know from Grace and DeMello's work, that confusion, it's a double-edged sword. Okay, so when you experience confusion, if you can get over that confusion, you'll actually have a higher level of achievement than if you don't resolve that confusion, or if you didn't recognize that you should be confused to begin with. Okay, so there's productive confusion, but then there's unproductive confusion. Well, in our context, as you can see, metacognitive self-regulation was a negative predictor of achievement. Well, what we did was we replicated the study and we used a think aloud protocol with a sample of 114 participants because we wanted to find out why there was this negative relationship between metacognitive self-regulation and achievement. And what we found was that students were actually metacognitively monitoring their confusion. They were monitoring, well, what is it that I'm being confused about, and not focusing on the content. And so we saw a negative relationship there. And so I would say that there may even be a double-edged sword to metacognitive self-regulation. What are you monitoring? Okay? There might be productive metacognitive self-regulation versus unproductive metacognitive self-regulation. And that's something that we have to dig into a little bit deeper. So then I realized, well, if adults are having difficulties with confusion, and curiosity is such a good emotion for adults to experience, what about elementary students? Let's go back to mathematics for a minute. If you're given a complex mathematics problem, you're going to likely experience a lot of confusion, and discrepant events typically is what triggers these epistemic emotions. If we look at Grayson and DeMello's work, there's a lot of research that they've done using discrepant events, but it's been done with adults. And if there's a double-edged sword of confusion, what's going to happen with students at the elementary level? We know from the self-regulated learning literature that students are not very good at self-regulating their learning. They probably don't have the skills necessary to resolve that confusion when confusion in fact arises. So it became very important for me to go back to the elementary level and to look at the role of epistemic emotions during complex learning, during complex mathematics problem solving in particular. Now in the province of Quebec, each year students are given what's called a situational problem. And it's a very complex problem. It takes them several days to solve. So in this context, we have given them a problem called Start Your Engines. And for this particular problem, students had to create a 7-sided polygon that ranged in length between 4.5 to 5 kilometers. So of course it's on kilometers, they have to do a conversion down to centimeters. Sorry, I don't know what that is in miles or inches, but you guys can do the mathematical conversion there. And then they had to have at least one obtuse angle, one acute angle, one reflex angle. They had to draw a start line freeze pattern that's reflected twice, 1/3 of it white, calculate the cost of paint. I mean, it goes on and on. You guys get the idea. It's a very complex problem. These are students in grade 5. And so what we did is we had these students, in grade 5, I don't think I can do that. They're not easy. And students do this right from grade 1 on through. And it's a fantastic way to really bring real complex problems to students that they would experience in the real world. And so what we did is we measured students' emotions. We had them think out loud as they solved this problem. This was done over 4 days. So as you can imagine, it took us 8 months to actually code the think alouds. And we had to figure out, well, what are the relationships between epistemic emotions and self-regulatory processes in this particular context. And what we did is we went back to control and value as antecedents to the kinds of emotions that we expected students to experience. And we did a moderated mediation model. Because as you remember, control and value interact to predict the kinds of emotions that students will experience. And we wanted to go beyond just the enactment phase of self-regulated learning. We wanted to look at whether emotions predicted various phases like planning and goal setting, like metacognitive processing. And we wanted to look at the relations between deep processing strategies and shallow processing strategies and what the implications were for mathematics achievement. And this was recently published in Contemporary Educational Psychology, the results for this research. So again, another LA freeway, I apologize. I'm a big fan of these kinds of models. As you can see, control and value, they actually didn't interact. They were direct predictors of the emotions that students experienced. They were important. As you can see, these standardized regression coefficients are pretty significant. So I'll highlight a few here. So value was a positive predictor of curiosity and enjoyment. So the more you valued what you were doing, the more positive emotions you experienced. That's a good thing. And then the less you experienced confusion, frustration, and boredom. So that was also a good thing. Okay, with regard to control, you feel more control or in control of what you're doing. There's less confusion and anxiety. So again, that's also a good thing. These emotions mediate a relation between control and value, and they in fact predicted the self-regulatory phases. Okay? Planning and goal setting, use of deep and shallow processing strategies, as well as metacognitive strategies. Again, I'll highlight a few here. Curiosity, again, comes up as being a really important emotion. Shallow processing strategies and metacognitive strategies. It's a bit interesting with the shallow processing strategies, but when you think about it, mathematics problem solving, we had coded calculations as being shallow, but maybe they're not. Maybe that was our coding issue, but that was an important thing for students to do during this complex problem solving process. Confusion, unfortunately, was not a positive emotion for students to experience. It predicted a decrease in both shallow and deep processing strategies. And then what we see is that deep processing and metacognitive strategies were positive predictors of achievement. So it became important to us to really focus on confusion, and what we plan on doing now is we're developing an intervention to really normalize confusion for students. So when they do feel confusion, identify what are you confused about. It's okay to feel confused. Let's identify what it is, and then we're going to teach you the strategies to get over that confusion, to resolve that confusion so you can move forward. And that's what we're planning on doing in the next phase of this research. We also thought it was important to try to foster self-regulatory processes using different types of interventions or different paradigms and not just looking at emotions. And so one that we've recently focused on is the learning by teaching paradigm. Well, what is learning by teaching? Learning by teaching is a paradigm whereby students adopt the role of a teacher and teach content to others for instructional purposes. and others can be peers or computer-based agents. And what we did is we integrated this into a classroom or into a series of classrooms that use a one-to-one iPad program. And so students were able to develop teaching videos that explain, and explanation is a key component here, explains to others how you go about solving this complex mathematics problem. Okay, and this was recently accepted in Journal of Educational Psychology. So why did we take the learning by teaching paradigm or the learning by teaching approach? Well, if you look theoretically at the learning by teaching paradigm, students are theoretically said to organize and understand the content better when they know that they have to teach it to someone else, when they know they have to explain it to someone else. And this theoretically changes the way in which they approach material, or how they study the material, or how they solve the mathematics problem. They would argue that it would help them to engage in deeper learning, so we expect to see better learning processes, especially metacognitive monitoring. And this, of course, has implications for learning outcomes, so we'd expect to see higher levels of achievement. Now, a number of studies, this has been done since the 1980s, this is nothing new. The studies that typically have been done typically focused on learning outcomes. Some have looked at using think alouds to tap into the kinds of processes that students use. We do see differences in metacognitive processes, but we haven't really tapped into the first component, where students have to organize and understand the material better. And so we thought, well, this is a really important component to the puzzle. So if it's that important that students are organizing and understanding the content better before they even teach it, then we need to understand whether this is actually in fact the case and how are they going about doing that. So what we did is we gave students a complex mathematics problem. We had them create a concept map of their understanding of the problem space before they actually went about solving the problem. And here's an example of one of the poplets that the student had developed of her understanding of the complex mathematics problem. I know you guys can't read this text, but it was color-coded. So black was important information, green was the calculations that she had to do to carry out the problem, and red was the first question that she had to solve in order to begin before doing other types of questions within that bigger problem. And as you can see, what we did was we coded the concept maps for content that was included and the organizational structure. So was it hierarchically well organized? Was the calculations embedded with the important information? Did they know that there was only one particular problem that they had to solve first? And then we compared across two conditions. So what we did is we had two schools participate and we randomly assigned students. This is again grade 5. We randomly assigned them to the control condition where they just solved the problem, or to the learning by teaching condition. And they were told that when you solve this problem, after you finish solving the problem, you're going to create a teaching video that explains to others how to solve the problem. But we didn't have them actually create the video after, but we didn't analyze that. We looked at their solutions after they had finished solving the problem. So time on task was equivalent across the two conditions. And so what did we see? With regard to the concept map of the problem space, their understanding of the problem, students in the learning by teaching condition developed a better concept map than students in the control condition. Okay, there was about a 10% difference in terms of quality of the concept map that they developed. That's a huge difference. And what we saw in the think alouds was that students constantly went back to the concept map to identify, it's kind of like a roadmap for them to identify how to go through solving the problem. So this is a really important first step. And we saw a main effect of gender. And of course, this is all control for, prior knowledge was control for in this context. So what does it look like visually? So we got the learning by teaching condition outperforming the learning for learning condition. Now the concept maps were compared to an expert concept map. So as you can see, they didn't actually do very well in general, but there's still a difference between them. Well, I had a 54%, the same percentage as my first mathematics exam, but still. And they were learning how to develop concept maps, so this was just the first step for them. With regard to self-regulatory processes, we found main effect of gender for planning and goal setting, for cognitive strategies, and for metacognitive strategies. We only found a main effect of condition for metacognitive strategies. Okay, so students in the learning by teaching condition used more metacognitive strategies than students in the control condition. And this is what it looks like visually. So again, girls are doing better than boys with regard to use of those strategies. Okay, so we've got, this is the teaching condition, so learning by teaching condition, and this is the control condition. So when we average these across, these are equivalent except for this one here where there's more metacognitive strategy use. Okay, so what does it look like with regard to achievement? We found a main effective condition. So students in the learning by teaching condition, their average for the complex mathematics problem solution is about 8%, 8.5% higher than the students in the control condition. So again, this is a big difference. Okay? And we saw, of course, main effective gender. And this is the visual representation here. So students in the learning by teaching condition did particularly well, especially females, okay, compared to students in the control condition. There was no interaction there between gender, though, and condition. So, after a decade of knowledge and knowing, what insight do I have for you? Well, as Socrates once said, all I know is that I know nothing. Well, I wouldn't say that I know nothing, but I do know that I have a lot more to learn. There's a lot more to be done. Well, what kinds of things have we learned? We know that context plays an important role in the activation of epistemic beliefs. Okay. And to give Jeff Green a little bit of a plug, we've got a handbook of epistemic cognition coming in whereby we've proposed a new model called the PACES model. Okay. So what is PACES? What does it represent? Pedagogy, assessment, curriculum, evaluation, and support are all factors that affect the development of students' epistemic beliefs and epistemic change. So that's an important one. The title is Climate for Epistemic Change. Epistemic beliefs are really difficult to measure. That's why we switched to the Think Louds and are measuring more epistemic cognition, which are manifestations of epistemic beliefs, but they're more difficult to change. These often are very deeply rooted beliefs. Beliefs have been developed over decades of educational experiences, and it's extraordinarily difficult to change what you've experienced your whole entire life. It might be a little easier in other contexts, maybe in the social sciences, but in mathematics, they're particularly difficult. They're deeply rooted beliefs. Students at all ages must be taught high-quality epistemic cognitive processes. We need to teach students that they need to think critically. We need to teach them what are good sources of information. Jenny McCarthy is not a good source of information, okay? When you go online, you start reading all of that information that pops up. If you're doing a search on climate change or genetically modified organisms, or what do I need to eat after I finish an Ironman in order to maintain my levels of sanity? Those are all important things to consider. What are good sources of information? When you have conflicting information, you need to be able to evaluate what is logical, what is consistent, what is accepted as true, and what might be accepted as true, they might not be true tomorrow. Ditto for self-regulated learning. Students need to be taught the self-regulatory skills needed in order to resolve confusion, in order to understand and elaborate what it is that they are learning. And this needs to be done at the elementary level. And there are a number of programs that have been developed over time, of course. But we still see students coming into first-year university with really poor self-regulatory skills. I was one of them. And also really poor belief systems in place. And so that's something that we need to target early on and continue to do that for students. Emotions cannot be ignored. I tried to ignore them. As a cognitive researcher, as a cognitive psychologist, I tried to ignore them for a really long time. Emotions are messy. We don't want to go there. Well, we have to go there. We can't ignore them. They are ubiquitous. Emotions are everywhere, especially if you're working with high school students. They're very emotional. These are things that you need to consider. Whether you're doing research in epistemic beliefs, or in self-regulated learning, or in literacy, or in development, whatever your area of research is, emotions are there. And so it's time to take a look at those emotions. Anxiety is a really well-researched emotion, but it's not the only emotion we need to take into consideration. Let's foster curiosity. Let's foster enjoyment in learning if we can, and give them the tools necessary when they have those negative emotional experiences, because they're going to have them. And that's okay too. So as Plato once said, human behavior flows from three main sources: desire, which we call motivation, emotion, and knowledge. And I plan on continuing to pursue these different areas. So, for my future directions, what do I plan on doing? Well, as I mentioned, there's three facets to my research: epistemic cognition, epistemic emotions, and self-regulated learning. And I'll continue to look at the interactions between these three different facets of research. I'd like to continue to foster epistemic change, but in fostering epistemic change, we know those negative emotional experiences are going to arise. People don't want to let go of their beliefs. They're really difficult to let go. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to foster those positive epistemic emotional experiences for students. And when they're not positive, and sometimes they're not going to be, they need to be taught the necessary skills in order for them to get over those negative experiences. And so we need to scaffold self-regulatory processes. I will continue to pursue in the areas of socio-scientific issues. So we've done research on climate change. We're now doing research on genetically modified organisms and looking at and going beyond correlational data and actually manipulating consistency across the tasks, but also consistency or inconsistency with students' beliefs. So we have those two different conditions so we can actually make causal claims. One of the areas that I think will be really interesting in the near future, I have a number of pediatricians that I'm working with currently, and we are going to target the anti-vaccination movement. So all the misinformation that is out there is really troubling to me. And so we need to work together in order to inform people about the decisions whether to vaccinate or not, and why not vaccinating is not a good decision. And as I said, Jen McCarthy is not a very good source of information. And so that would be really interesting because people are really emotional when it comes to the topic of vaccinations. So that's something that we're going to take into consideration as well. And of course, at the heart of my research will always be mathematics. With regard to thank yous, I have many thank yous to give. I won't go through everyone here, but I do want to thank Phil Winnie, who's my academic advisor, is the best advisor you could possibly ask for, who's been a mentor for me and continues to be a mentor for me today, as well as my committee, Jack Mertens and Campbell, and Barbara Hofer and Pat Alexander, who were really supportive and have been supportive of my career. My UNLV family, who were very welcoming when I got to UNLV, and my McGill family, as well as colleagues who are here today that I work with and continue to work with and always keep me on my toes. This is a good thing. My graduate students and, of course, my family, who are always supportive of the amount of work that I'm constantly doing and always having to hide away in my office and get that paper done. So I started with quotes, and I'm going to end with a quote. So before I finished my dissertation, someone had come up to my dad and said, "So what is your daughter up to?" And my dad said, "Oh, she's about to defend her PhD." And the guy said, "Oh, she's doing her PhD. She must be really smart." And my dad said, and he's a man of many words, he said, "She's not smart. She just works hard." Now think about that for a minute. I believe that putting effort into it was not a smart thing to do. So what do I believe now? Well, I believe that effort is smart. So working hard is the smart thing to do. And working hard will make you smarter. It's curious how your beliefs can change. Thank you. Questions? Tony?
So I'm glad you brought up your dad at the end there, because something I've been growing much more curious about and interested in is the role of parents in these beliefs and emotions, etc. So I'm wondering if that's something you have explored or considered exploring.
I think I haven't explored it myself, but I think it does play an important role. I think that if your parents are really supportive and they believe that effort is really important, that's a really good thing because the children are going to espouse that as well. I don't know what happened with me in math, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I was an athlete as well, and we always really tried hard. Like, I'm a really competitive person when it comes to sports. And so effort was absolutely essential for sports, but for math, I guess because it was just really easy for me, I just thought, you don't have to put effort into it. I had the math gene. Apparently drank the math gene out in the first few weeks of university. I don't know, but I think it's an important consideration. I think that looking at parental beliefs are really important to consider for sure. That isn't something that I've pursued, but I think that's an important line of research. I know that a number of people in motivation have looked at that. And especially, I think, in the context of mathematics, the mother's beliefs are far more influential for the daughter than father's beliefs or mother's beliefs on the son, if I'm not mistaken. Nancy?
I'm fascinated by your work with elementary children, I imagine. I'm interested in your approach to intervention and how you're involving classroom teachers, perhaps, if you are.
Yeah, actually, it was the classroom teacher that was the one that had put it together. So it's a funny story. So my daughter started at the school, and I walked in for the welcoming night for the parents, and it was a kindergarten teacher who was integrating iPads in the classroom. I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And Phil obviously does a lot of stuff in technology, but I hadn't really adopted that in my own research. And when I got to Dorset and they were using technology right at the kindergarten, I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. This is really fascinating to me. So I started doing research, and one of the papers is actually published recently in Learning and Instruction on the use of feedback to help students develop literacy skills. And what we found was that the students, they like the feedback when it's positive, but they don't like the feedback when it's negative. But it actually did when so we randomly assigned them, well, actually it was a repeated measures, but when they were given feedback, they did better. Their performance was better than when they weren't given feedback. These are kindergarten students. And a lot of us assume that kids can't self-regulate their learning at that level. Well, this was evidence that there was, and I know you have found evidence as well too. That early elementary students can actually self-regulate their learning. They're just not very good at it because they haven't been taught those skills yet. And so when I was doing this research in the kindergarten classroom, the grade 5 teacher came down and said, I've got this idea. I want to integrate this into my classroom, and I want someone to evaluate it. I want to know if learning by teaching, she didn't call it learning by teaching, but she explained it to me, and I said, oh, that's learning by teaching. She goes, I want to know if this is effective, because students are really struggling with these difficult mathematics problems. And because she had integrated it into her classroom, she was using Padlet. They were using NoteShelf to solve the problem. They were using Doodlecast to develop these teaching videos. She had developed the whole thing. She had developed the Padlet color coding scheme. And so I just walked in and said, okay, these are the instruments we're going to use. And then we got a couple of other teachers involved so that we could increase our sample size. And she ran the show. She and I actually travel around the country and teach others how to integrate this, and she's sort of the head of it all. She's an Apple Distinguished Educator, and she's the one that takes credit for this intervention. And so it is completely teacher-based. It is teacher-taught and teacher-run, and this was developed by a teacher, so it's pretty fascinating work. Yeah, this was exciting. So they are very involved, and we give workshops every few months to other teachers on how to integrate it. And what we do is we bring all the grade 5 students, and the grade 5 students actually go out and they teach the teachers how to implement the program. So it's a good learning experience for everybody.
So you saw gender differences in learning by teaching.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you thought about where they came from, or...
Well, I think the girls were just stronger in mathematics. I think that's the trend that we see nowadays, at least in the Quebec system, that girls are outperforming boys in math. They're using more self-regulatory strategies, they're doing better in math. And so I think that was just sort of the pattern that we saw. Is there a gender difference in teaching? We actually have just finished phase 2, and we're going to evaluate the teaching videos this time. So we had 3 different conditions, and we'll see if there's a difference there. But I don't know if it's because it was them teaching, because it was really just a self-explanation video as opposed to teaching others. So I don't know yet.
We're over time. Yes. A lot of us have to be in a room down the hall.
Okay. Thank you.